This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Hello everyone. You're listening to Speaking of Asia, and I'm Ravi. In this episode, I focus on the ongoing Indian election in which Prime Minister Narendra Modi is bidding for a third term. India is often called the world's biggest democracy. Because the country is so big, the election is being held over 7 stages and will take 6 weeks to complete. Almost 1 billion people are eligible to vote, and the results will be known on June 4th. What happens then is important also because India is the world's 5th biggest economy. To discuss this so-called festival of democracy, I have with me Professor Iqbal Singh Sevea, Director of the Institute for South Asian Studies in Singapore. Welcome to Speaking of Asia, Dr. Sevea.
Pleasure to be here, Ravi.
Dr. Sevea, we're now midway into the Indian election, and what has struck you most about the election so far?
You know, when you have an election where you have a potential electorate of 969 million voting, it grabs eyeballs. So one obvious thing that I'm looking out to see is the voter turnout, because this is reflective of how people are feeling about the current government, but also how they're feeling about the opposition in these elections as well. And we're seeing some interesting things emerge in this way. Ravi, you started by alluding to the term festival of elections. You know, in India, the elections are often compared to festivals, celebrations, etc. This time round, one thing that strikes me is perhaps a slight lack of enthusiasm on the part of the voters. We are getting indications that voter turnout from the first and the second phase of the elections have been less than they have been in previous cycles of elections. In some cases, we are anticipating a 4% drop in voter participation as well. Now, these are interesting signals because the last 2 elections in which Modi and the BJP have emerged as clear victors in the elections, we've seen what people have described as wave elections, where there's been a very strong pro-Modi sentiment or pro-BJP sentiment. I would say pro-Modi rather than pro-BJP. We're not seeing that this time round necessarily. Again, I'm working on figures that we don't have accurate details about in terms of where people are voting, in which constituencies people are turning out, etc. But the general indications that I'm interested in looking at is the voter turnout and how this is playing out.
We'll come back to turnout in a bit. But could you talk to our readers a little bit about the broad lines on which this election is being fought? What are the main planks of the government and the opposition?
Let me start with the government first. The government, or the BJP-led government, is pitching these elections as one of continuity. So if we look at their manifesto and we look at their policy statements, we don't find any big-ticket change issues. So there's no big thing that they're selling that will definitely change with the next election. There are some suspicions about what they might do, but in terms of their political electoral pitch is more of continuity, stability, and more of the same in that direction. And Modi is positioning himself as the figure that can take India into developed country status by 2047. So that's the major pitch in that sense. If I was to sum it up in one line, it would be stability and more of the same. If we turn to the opposition, we see a very different picture. Now, the Modi government presents India as one that has economically succeeded. It's on its way to big. It's as you mentioned at the start of the podcast, India is the 5th largest economy. It's racing towards being the 3rd largest economy in the world as well. And so the Modi government is positioning itself in that way, that we are taking India on this trajectory. The opposition, on the other hand, is arguing that the story is not as rosy for everyone in India. And they have particularly highlighted 2 things which are very important in these elections. One being the high rates of unemployment, and 2 being inflation. Now, the Congress, of course, is pitching itself as the party that can create jobs and is interested in creating jobs. The BJP, on the other hand, is arguing that its policies are the best way to go forward. So if we look at the economic realm, we see the argument being presented by the opposition that we need to solve the issue of unemployment and inflation. However, if I may add this, if we actually compare their policy pitches on the economic front, there's not that much of significant difference in what they're pushing for. They're both arguing in terms of implementation. So the Congress doesn't differ in liberalizing certain sectors. The Congress doesn't differ in pushing ahead FTAs, etc. So it's more about how do we deal with this issue of unemployment and inflation. If we look at domestic politics issues, there again, we see rhetoric from both sides. Now, and this rhetoric has actually changed. When the first phase of the election started, there was emphasis on Modi selling the achievements of his government. And I'm going to say something that is more conjecture at the moment because we don't have the figures for the electoral vote to turn out in detail. But there seems to have been a shift in Modi's rhetoric and the BJP's rhetoric after the first phase of the election, which is now more focused on issues of community, sort of shaping a sort of Hindu electorate as well. So we're seeing some of this come out. So what we are essentially seeing is an election that in some ways, both parties are not differing fundamentally on the economic policies, but it's more about how do you get people out there to vote. Now, where we do see some fundamental difference is when it comes to welfare policies. Now, I must add this, that one of the points that has really drawn a lot of support for the Modi government is the fact that they are associated with pushing through certain welfare policies. And we can talk more about that if you like to. But the Congress is pitching a broader set of welfare policies, universal healthcare, Mahalakshmi scheme, which involves the direct depositing of X number of amount of lakhs into households' bank account, etc. So this is where you do see a difference in terms of domestic policies, the welfare policies there. And if I may just conclude by saying that if we look at the foreign policy sector, again, I don't see very much difference in the way both are pitching themselves in this election. So the key things, unemployment issue, inflation, and welfare policies.
Very interesting. Singaporeans of Indian descent and a broad number of other Singaporeans also seem to be following this election with quite a bit of interest. What stakes does Singapore have in this Indian election, and what are its main points of interest?
Well, the first broad point to note is that India's position in the global economy and in geopolitics has changed over the past few years. India is now fundamentally important for the future of the global economy, but also an increasingly important player in the geopolitical environment. This is partly because of geopolitical competition and geoeconomic competition between the US and China and the rise of the China plus one strategy. So India is benefiting from this, and in return, India is playing a more engaged role in the global terrain. This, of course, impacts Singapore itself. If the China plus one strategy leads to more manufacturing in India, then supply chains are redirected towards India. So that's something that Singapore is definitely keen on. But if we focus in on the Singapore-India relationship, we find that economically this relationship has grown tremendously in the past decade or so. Singapore is now the largest source of foreign direct investment into India. Singapore is also home to more than 9,000 Indian companies.
It's 9,000 now?
That's the figure I'm familiar with. May have grown, in fact.
I see.
And so, that itself, that figure itself, and the very fact that Singapore is such a huge player in foreign direct investment in India shows why these elections are significant to Singapore. Now, the other thing is that Singapore is also, or has been, a conduit for India to deal with ASEAN as well. So the relationship between India and Singapore must be seen in this broader context of India and ASEAN trade, India and ASEAN connectivity, but also the Asia-Pacific region and India's role in the Indo-Pacific in that sense.
I do remember that years ago when Mr Narendra Rao began to open up the Indian economy in 1991, he saw Singapore as something of a springboard for India's Look East policy, as he called it. Mr Modi, the Prime Minister, today talks about an Act East policy. Now, how much of it is rhetoric and how much of it is truly acted upon?
This is $1 million question, actually. There is a fair amount of rhetoric of a shift from Look East to Act East. But there is also an actual shift in emphasis as well. And this is also related to the wider geopolitical, geoeconomic terrain shifts in terrain that I mentioned earlier. What you're seeing is India has realized that Southeast Asia is a very important region for its own development in terms of supply chains, but also in terms of digital connectivity. Increasingly, there will be emphasis in this region on sharing electricity as well, whereas we know there's discussion about electricity grids, but also in the sector of sustainability and environmental change. These are issues that India cannot deal with in isolation. Now, we are also noticing a more direct involvement of India in the geopolitics of Asia Pacific. The very fact that India has been one of those pushing the terminology of the Indo-Pacific rather than the Asia Pacific shows how it's seeing this region in itself and how it's acting. India is today part of a number of multilateral forums that involve Southeast Asia. They may not have Southeast Asia countries participating, but they involve Southeast Asia. The Quad being one of them, East Asia Summit being another. India has also expanded its engagement with ASEAN itself. In 2018, it's escalated its partnership with ASEAN. So there are concrete steps that have been taken. And if I may give one small example, I shouldn't say small example, but one important example, is the very fact of India's UPI being connected to Singapore's Pay Now system. This terrain of digitalization that's going on and digital connectivity, this is going to play out in important ways with ASEAN.
UPI being a unified payment interface.
Yes, indeed.
I see. But at the same time, I do remember that when he was Finance Minister of India years ago, Dr. Manmohan Singh traveled to Singapore to explain the new economic policies that he and Prime Minister Rao had put into place. And when Dr. Singh was Prime Minister of India in 2005, he signed CECA, the Comprehensive Economic Cooperation Agreement with Singapore. It was seen then as a landmark because India had never done such a big trade and agreement ever. But then we saw India sort of recusing itself, to be polite, or shall we say withdrawing from the RCEP negotiations to our deep regret. Can you explain this dichotomy between an activist policy and refusing to engage on trade in a fuller manner?
The situation with RCEP basically boils down to India's concern over being in a trade deal, if I may use that term, in which China is a dominant player, given the trade imbalance between China and India. That's one of the concerns. The other concerns are domestic terrains, where there is a push within some sectors in India for some protectionist policies. So those are the two underlying issues. And as observers of India will know, that the latter, the issue of negotiating the domestic positions on such issues, is a very complicated issue. Even governments such as the BJP that had such a huge majority in parliament are hesitant to push through certain economic policies because you still do need to rely on allies, if not at the central level, at the state levels. So India, of course, as you're familiar with, has a very vibrant democratic structure in which federalism is important as well. So these are the constraints that India was negotiating in the RCEP. At the ideational level, it would like the idea of trading with everyone, but there are certain constraints there. And these constraints will continue to be there, and they will have to be negotiated by subsequent governments. However, we also should perhaps focus on the fact that India has been more forthcoming in pursuing FTAs with individual countries as well. And that's one step that we need to pay attention to, and is pushing that forward. You mentioned CECA, and CECA became the model for other FTAs as well. So perhaps we should also look at that and see how India is positioning itself in that way.
Very interesting. To come back to the election, while there is Prime Minister Modi and the BJP on one side, and Prime Minister seems so dominant, straddles the nation and the politics, I'm not even clear which is the principal opposition party. Is Congress still the core of the opposition alliance called India?
This is a complicated question to answer, because the question itself actually is the answer, and it presents the answer in itself. That essentially you have an alliance in which you have one central party, the Congress here, and you have numerous regional parties that actually are the ones that could play the trump card in this election and subsequent elections. So let me answer this question by taking it in a slightly different direction, if I may. What we are noticing in this election, at least in my assessment, is that we don't have an election where there is a strong push to vote for Modi or vote for the BJP. we don't have a strong push to vote for the Congress. The election, in my assessment, has become what some people would perhaps call a normal election, as opposed to a wave election. A normal election is in which day-to-day issues become important. And at the regional level, say you are a voter in Karnataka, say you are a voter in Bengal, say you're a voter in any other state of India, you may vote in these elections for your regional party that is allied with one of the central parties. So in that sense, while the Congress remains a central party because it's holding the alliance together at the center, the regional players are important in their individual states, we may actually find voters who choose not to vote for the BJP actually voting for their regional parties rather than the Congress. And the India alliance is formed along this understanding itself. So it's interesting to see who the voters will actually vote for.
There are two things that strike me about this election. The first is that Mr. Modi does not seem to be touting his own record in office that much. And secondly, that the BJP is not attacking Mr. Rahul Gandhi and the Gandhi family quite as much as it used to in previous elections. Why has this change happened? Has Mr. Gandhi's profile improved in India?
Let me start by the second point first. If we compare these elections with 2019 and 2014, we find that there's a somewhat change in how Rahul Gandhi is perceived. There was to be very, very honest, the expression that was used for him in the 2019 election was Pappu, which insinuated somebody who's not as wise as they may seem to be.
A genial dunce, as it's described, yes.
You frame it much better than me.
Oh.
We're not seeing so much of that now. I think years of trying to reshape that sort of an image on the part of the Congress and others has had some success. He's also been involved in a number of mass movements recently. He led walks to various parts of India, the Bharat Jodo Yatra being one of them. So there is a significant change in the way he's perceived. So I think that attack may not have worked initially. So there is an assessment that perhaps not to go down that route. I want to qualify my statement by saying that I'm not necessarily suggesting that Rahul Gandhi is seen as a potential rival of Modi. All opinion polls have shown that he lags substantially behind in the popular perception in that sense. But perhaps that rhetoric of attacking him as a Pappu may not have worked this time round. On the first question itself, with regards to how Modi is positioning himself in these elections, it's important to note that the elections are still all about him. Every rally, every statement is primarily about his positioning in the political structure and how he can lead India. So it's very much a sort of a trust vote in him that he's shaping it out to be. In the first phase of the elections, we did notice a start with the sort of discussions about economic growth, etc. But the question of unemployment has come back to hit them, and it's something that they have to grapple with. So in that sense, they have reoriented the way they are pitching their rallying points, etc. in the second phase, and I'm keen to see what's going to happen in the next few phases as well. But if I may also add here, again, there is a realization that these elections are pretty much going to be fought on local issues and local forms of organization, getting the voter to the polling booth, etc. So I think the focus is primarily on local-based support groups now.
Mm-hmm. It's very interesting. I covered 8 Indian elections in my career. And generally, the trend has been voter participation has been rising. And you alluded to it earlier when you said this time there's been a bit of a dip in the first 2 rounds of polling. What do you think is causing this dip?
Well, some observers say it's the heat, that the weather is not being kind to voter participation level. But my own sense is it's not just about the weather. There is a sense of apathy as well. There is a sense of I'm not driven to vote for the party that's in power. But at the very same time, the opposition party, the Congress in particular, has not been able to enthuse the voter to come out and vote. This is the sense that I'm getting in my own observation of voting trends in parts of India. So people are going to come out. Those who are committed to certain parties are going to come out to vote for them. But generally, there doesn't seem that much of enthusiasm either way. And I think the question needs to be asked why the opposition was not able to capitalize on this in getting their voters out.
And what would be your response to that?
My response to that would be twofold. Firstly, the opposition parties, especially the Congress, has been organizationally weakened over the past few years. It does not have the organization structure that would allow them to actually get their voters out, but also enthuse their voters in that sense. The other thing is perhaps, hindsight is always 2020. The India alliance that was formed, perhaps the seats sharing agreements could have come out earlier. More work could have been done on the ground in that sense.
You're quite right about the fading structure of the Congress Party and its organizational apparatus. Because you can go into many northern Indian cities today and ask for the Congress office, and the taxi driver would not know where that is. Heat aside, I recently read about BJP leaders castigating their local party activists for fewer women turning out to vote this time. Generally, women seem to be more in Mr. Modi's corner than in the other. He seems to have a very good profile with women. What impact do you think this could have on the election?
Now, as you rightly point out, that women have become a very important electoral segment in determining how the voting plays out and who wins the elections, not only at the center, but even regional level as well. And this is linked to the welfare policies that have been implemented by the BJP. There has been a direct association of these welfare policies with Prime Minister Modi and the BJP. But there's also been a sort of a reworking of certain welfare policies. There's been a more emphasis on direct cash transfer. There's been more emphasis on direct connection between the Prime Minister, the government, and the receiver of the welfare policies. In that sense, the middle ground has been cut off. So that sort of explains, one of the reasons that explains why women in various parts of India have voted in specific ways. Now, in these elections, and I'm conjecturing here, one of the issues that may be is that you have an opposition which is promising a broader spectrum of welfare policies. So in that sense, that could be interesting to note.
Dr. Sevea, exit polls are banned in India, but are there any indications at all which way this election could go?
You rightly point out that the exit polls are not allowed to be telecast till the elections have ended, and so we'll get a sense of what the exit polls are saying on June the 1st or June the 2nd, depending on when they are allowed to telecast them. But we've had a spate of opinion polls that have indicated that the Prime Minister Modi-led government will have a BJP party led by Prime Minister Modi will have a substantial majority in Parliament. Those are the indications coming out of the opinion polls. However, one question to consider as we look back at those opinion polls and how the election is playing is this issue that I keep coming back to about voter turnout. When voter turnout dips by 3 to 4%, as the indications are, we then start considering where voters are turning up, in which constituencies voters are turning up, but also which voters are turning out. So these are questions that are making these opinion polls more interesting to judge. Judging from everything that we've seen so far, the indications are still that the BJP should emerge with a substantial majority. Surprises have happened before, but I think the smart money would be on the number of seats that the BJP had won previously coming down by somewhat, but still the BJP coming out victorious in these elections.
Mm-hmm. I was watching Prime Minister Modi last night on a television interview, and he seemed supremely confident. He was glowing practically. But then he always does that. And going into the election, he was regarded as the world's most popular leader. And the election was seen almost like a cakewalk for Mr. Modi and the BJP. But it's noteworthy that the party has stopped talking about gaining 400 seats. Do you think this election could spring a surprise in any way?
It remains to be seen what sort of a surprise. I think the indications are that 400 and above. In fact, they pitched two numbers, 370 and above. And the play on 370 is interesting. It tagged it to the revoking of Article 370, which was a legislative issue in Kashmir. So that number was also sort of political jingle in a sense. And 400 was a number that was pitched. But you rightly mentioned this rhetoric has disappeared now. The expectations have come down somewhat. And if they are not using the indication, then it probably indicates to us that their internal surveys are showing them that that's probably not achievable in that sense. The key thing to consider here is that when the BJP in 2019 got 353 seats in parliament, one could actually surmise that that's a maxing out. There were a number of states in India, Haryana, Rajasthan, etc., and Gujarat being one of them as well, where they won every seat that they contested for. That's hard to repeat. And so that's one very major point that we need to note here. The other thing is that to get from 353 to 370 to 380, the BJP would not only need to retain everything it won previously, but to make a substantial expansion. So I'm not sure how realistic those targets were. But looking at the ground realities now, it seems like that number may not be what they themselves are considering achievable.
Dr. Sevea, how did you assess the arrests of the Delhi Chief Minister, Mr. Arvind Kejriwal, just before the election, and also the tax authorities freezing the bank accounts of the Congress party? Some analysts thought that it sort of radiated a bit of nervousness from the government and the BJP. Do you accept that line of thinking?
The arrest itself is one issue, but the timing of the arrest is the major issue here. And what is perhaps more important than in this regard is how this is seen by people in India itself. Now, again, it boils down to party lines as well. If you are a BJP supporter, you probably see this as a corrupt government and corrupt leader that needed to be arrested, etc., and an issue that needed to be dealt with. But if you are an opposition supporter, you would see it very differently, and you would see it in the light of an attempt to stub out potential strong form of opposition, but also to weaken the party. But another point that's also important here is to split certain parties. So the accusation that's been leveled against the BJP has been that it has used charges of corruption to basically split members from parties, etc., and therefore strengthening its own position in specific states, etc. So again, it boils down to, who you support and which way you view this.
Every election brings out a bit of bitterness inevitably because the contestation is so severe. But this time it has seemed a bit more shrill. The BJP has seemed to take somewhat of a pronounced anti-Muslim line, more than in previous elections, I thought. And the Congress and others have stressed on poverty, income disparities, and on caste. Can India heal its wounds once these elections are over? And how important is it for India to heal its wounds?
Well, it's incredibly important for India to heal its wounds. We've had anybody who is familiar with India's history knows that these issues can lead to dire consequences. And you rightly point out, rhetoric has focused, I would say a lot of rhetoric has focused on religion, religious identity, and caste from either side. And these are issues that will have to be grappled with in the near future to see what happens in the medium term itself. But the thing we perhaps should also note is that in terms of religious rhetoric that's used in the elections now, we know the BJP has a particular ideological bent. That's no secret in that way. But at the same time, we also need to note that there are always 60-odd% of people in India who don't vote for a party on ideological basis itself. So we should not assume that the Hindutva rhetoric is a uniform rhetoric that's bought into by the masses in India. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out as a rallying point in these elections. On the other hand, with the caste issue, here we have a structural issue that will have to be dealt with. Irrespective of whether the Congress actually wins, it has put something on the table that whichever government comes to power will have to grapple with. The issue of the caste census. This is not going to disappear.
What's important about the caste census?
Well, from the perspective of the Congress, the caste census is something that would demonstrate, at a basic level, will show the numerics of how many people there are who belong to whichever caste, but more importantly, how many people from specific caste groups have government jobs, are in universities, etc. So the argument presented by the Congress, and not just the Congress, but a number of other parties that are both allied with the BJP and the Congress, is that this will be a form of dealing with the issue of structural discrimination, structural issues related to lower caste not being able to avail themselves of education or jobs, etc. That's the argument presented by these parties themselves. Now, this is going to be an important issue because caste is a fundamental issue in elections. That's something that we have to grapple with. So when this is put on the table, this is something that's not easy to be struck aside in the coming years. So even if the Congress doesn't gain as many votes as it hopes it will, it has put something on the table that will have to be dealt with by the subsequent governments.
It's fascinating. What about the effect on the diaspora? The Indian diaspora is very vocal, very patriotic, very loyal to their home countries. All the stuff that's happening in India, does it have an impact outside of India? And is that something that we in Singapore should keep an eye on?
I think it's important to note that elections are followed, developments in India are followed extensively by the diaspora, be it in Singapore or elsewhere as well. And this has been the case for some time now. You know, in fact, the Congress initiated the idea of reaching out to the diaspora, etc., and that's been going on for decades. Under the BJP, we've seen a more, if I may say, efficient way of doing it, a more effective way of doing it as well. So certainly there's outreach in that sense. But we also live in the world of social media now. And social media has created a sort of a connective bond that in which there's more real-time engagement. But there's also non-mediated engagement as well. So anybody sitting in the diaspora is not necessarily getting their information from the BJP party or the Congress, etc., but from certain social media influencers or just reading what's being posted. So I think the dynamics of it has changed, the way this connection, the way this information is presented, etc., and the way it's received. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out.
Mm-hmm. India is often cited as the world's fastest growing major economy. And the statistics seem fairly positive and healthy. How important is it that Mr. Modi gets a strong mandate, if only to keep this growth trajectory undisturbed?
This question actually relates to a broader point about it's not just important to see who wins the election, but sometimes in India it's important to see by how much they win. The reason for that being that there are always allies that are, not always, but many a time you need allies to form governments. And especially if as projections go, the BJP's numbers come down this time, the allies become more important. Many of these allies may have different economic perspectives, but also different constituencies within India that they need to rely on, etc. So in that sense, we know that any prime minister that comes will need to push through economic reforms, liberalize sectors of the economy, be it the banking sector, be it the manufacturing sector as well. Now, these are issues that, assuming Prime Minister Modi, as the indications are showing, comes back to power, will have to deal with. Obviously, a stronger mandate would allow him to push these policies through, given that this is probably his last elections as a central leader. He may want to leave a legacy behind in that sense. And this may also impact his foreign policy approach as well. I should just throw that out there as well.
In what sense would that?
Well, there are questions about when he comes back, if he comes back to power, would he then make another pitch to have better relations with the neighbors? Would he then perhaps try and reach out to Pakistan again, but also cement the relations with Bangladesh and Sri Lanka? So there are some perspectives about that. That could be a legacy issue.
What about the most important neighbor of his, China? In a recent interview with Newsweek magazine, Prime Minister spoke about the Chinese relationship as being something of prime importance to be fixed. And it's really not gone anywhere in the last 3 years. It's been terrible, in fact. How important is it for Mr. Modi to fix the China relationship?
Well, the China relationship is incredibly important. As we know, there have been border clashes in the past. Nothing's happened fairly recently, but this question is the border clashes in 2020. But the China relationship is also important, not just in terms of border clashes with India and China, but also China's expanding reach in South Asia. Now, we know that China is positioning itself as an important player in Bangladesh. Sri Lanka, it's been there for some time. Things have worked out in different ways there. But the Maldives elections recently have shown a swing towards, in Maldives, a swing towards China. So this is a question for India, not just in terms of its Himalayan borders, but also its maritime coast and relationship with its close neighbors. So in that sense, this is a fundamentally important relationship for India. The other thing to note in relation to this is that despite border tensions, despite geopolitical tensions rising between India and China, the trade between India and China has continued to rise. In fact, the manufacturing sector in India relies on Chinese products as well. So if you want to build a manufacturing sector in India, sort of linked to China.
Even the Apple factories need parts from China.
Precisely. So this is a relationship that will need delicate balancing and development. And the indications from India, from both central parties, is that they want to have a normalization of relationships with China.
That must be very reassuring for a lot of Singaporeans. Well, Dr. Sevea, thank you for coming and speaking of Asia. Your knowledge of India is most impressive. Thank you very much for sharing it with our listeners.
It's been a pleasure joining you today. Thank you.
And that's a wrap for Speaking of Asia, a podcast series by the Straits Times. I'm Ravi Veloor. Don't forget to share this podcast with your friends and family. If you'd like to read my articles, we have links in our podcast show notes below.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.